If you have your bulletins, if you pull them out, and you will see your connection card there, whether you are a first-time guest, whether this is part of your weekly rhythm, we ask that you fill them out so it helps us better know how we can serve you during this season. We're going to continue on in Matthew chapter 6 as we're walking through the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus hits on a topic that everybody thinks about. The topic is money. And whether you are a billionaire or whether you don't have anything, you think about money. And you think about what's to come. And so, when we get to Matthew chapter 6, let me start by saying that a couple years ago we kind of walked through this book together. It's called The Treasure Principle. And Matthew chapter 6 and the Treasure Principle, this book is written kind of based off of Matthew chapter 6, the verses that we're going to go over, and some other verses. And so if you have not read the Treasure Principle, and you want to read this little book, I want to get this for you. And so let me know, and I'll order however many copies of this book as people come up to me and ask that you want it, I'll order them. So if 20 people come to me, I'll order 20 copies, okay? So I want you guys to read this because this goes into a little more detail with Matthew chapter 6. It kind of brings in other passages about the treasure principle and what the treasure principle basically says from the passage that we're going to read today is you can't keep it, but you can pass it along. And so, if you haven't read the Treasure Principle, I want you to read it. I want you to read it because I think it'll really help shape how you view money, right? Now, Jesus in Luke chapter 12, Jesus gave a parable, and Jesus often told stories. He often told parables, and this is the parable that Jesus gave us in Luke chapter 12. He said there was a businessman. I'm going to kind of put it in today's perspective. There's a businessman or a businesswoman. And they were wealthy. And they had a really good year. And they decided to retire early. What they said was, gosh, I made a lot of money this year. And I can finally do what I've always wanted to do. I can finally get the house in Hawaii. And I can spend half the year in Hawaii and I can spend half the year in Oregon. And I can retire early. And man, I can just eat, drink, and be married. And Jesus said, following this story, Jesus said, but that night, God looked down and said, you fool, don't you know that your life is required of you? And this is the words of Jesus. He says in Luke 12, starting in verse 15, he says, life does not consist of an abundance of possessions. Verse 21, he says, this is how it will be for whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. Now, let's jump to Matthew chapter 6. Let's jump to Matthew chapter 6. This is what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 19. We're just going to go over 19 through 21. Next week we'll go over the other part of chapter 6, which says, don't store up treasures here on earth, where moths eat them and rust destroys them, where thieves break in and steal. Store your treasures in heaven, where moths and rust cannot destroy, and thieves do not break in and steal. Wherever your treasure is, there the desire, or wherever your treasure is, there the desire of your heart will be also. Now, Jesus continues from 22 through 24, those verses, and he addresses an objection that you and I have. See, let me just read to you 22, 23. It says, your eye is like a lamp that provides light for your whole body. When your eye is healthy, your whole body is filled with light. But when your eye is unhealthy, your whole body is filled with darkness. And if the light you think you have is actually darkness, how deep that darkness? Verse 24, no one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other, You'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You can't serve God. You cannot serve God and be enslaved to money. So what Jesus is doing here as he transitions from 21 to that next section, what he's doing is he's voicing an answer to our objection. See, the treasure principle says you can't keep it, but you can pass it along. Jesus is talking about money. He's not talking about your talent. He's not talking about your time. Jesus is talking about your money. And Jesus is talking about you giving your money away. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about you giving your money away. And so the objection that you have and the objection that I have is, wait a second, if I give everything away, I'm going to starve to death. I'm going to be homeless. And that's a valid objection. And Jesus answers that objection next week. And so here's what I want us to do. I want us to understand that we have an objection to what I'm going to say today, what Jesus tells us today. We have an objection. And that objection is, Jesus, but we're going to go broke. Jesus, but we're going to be homeless. I can't give up all my money. What I want you to do with that objection is just to hold on to it until next week. And this week, I want us just to hear the words of Jesus from verses 19 and 21. Okay? Hear the words of Jesus. If you have your message insert, I want you to pull it out. I got 2 points, 2 big ideas I want you to write down. The first big idea is this. You are actually commanded to store up treasures. I want you to write this down. You are actually commanded to store up treasures. Jesus wants you to store up treasures, ... just not here. Just not here. How many of you guys know what this is right here? Okay. We got a few. Okay. What is this? That's Uncle Scrooge's vault. Y'all know that. If you've ever watched DuckTales, you know you imagine yourself on the diving board, diving into the whole sea of money, right? What if I told you Jesus wants you to do that? See, we think of Uncle Scrooge, and the whole thing with Scrooge is that you're a Scrooge. So you store up the money and you don't give away the money. What if I told you Jesus wants you to have that vault? He just doesn't want you to have it here. He just doesn't want you to have it here. Look at his words again in verses 19 and 21. Don't store up treasures on earth where moths eat them and rust destroys them, where thieves break in and steal. Rather, store up treasures in heaven. So Jesus is telling you, store up treasures. Just don't do it here. Do it in heaven. Store up treasures in heaven where moths and rust cannot destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. Store up treasures in heaven that will be there for you for all eternity. Have Uncle Scrooge's vault. Just don't have it for the next 30 years. Have it for the next eternity. Now, we've all had new cars, right? And think about the car you're driving now. If you're like me, the car you're driving now, man, I ain't washed it in 5 months. I don't know what's in the back seat. I don't know what's on the floorboard. My wife cleaned out her van a couple weeks ago, and she found like an egg-wrapped tortilla. Now, here's the real problem with that. I haven't made that for breakfast for my kids since maybe summertime. I mean, like by the time she found it, it was a chicken wrap. You know what I mean? It was no egg wrap tortilla. And when we got that van, you know what we said? Kids, you're not eating in the back seat. We're cleaning out the car. But over time, we get a little lax. We get in a hurry. What you mean you haven't had breakfast? Just take it in the van with you. And before we know it, we got an egg wrap tortilla that's turned into a chicken in the back seat. We don't know how long it's been there. Right? Think about Christmas for you guys, for you parents or grandparents out there. How many of y'all before Christmas, you had to go into your kids' rooms, your grandkids' room, and you had to clean out previous Christmas presents to make room for this year's Christmas presents? What Jesus tells us, we know it's true. Don't store up treasures in heaven. Or don't store up treasures on earth, store up treasures in heaven. Because if you store up treasures here on earth, what's going to happen is they're going to get old. They're going to break. You're not going to take care of them. Moths will eat at your clothes. Rust will eat at the precious metal. And thieves will come and destroy it. And if the thieves don't destroy it, you know what? The economy will crash, and so your stock market, your house prices will plummet. What Jesus is telling us is store up treasures, but if you store up treasures on earth, it will disappear. And if the treasures don't disappear, you will disappear. If the treasures don't disappear, you will disappear. Store up treasures on heaven where you can enjoy them for all eternity. Now, in our minds, we know the difference between a short-term investment and a long-term investment. Right? We know the difference between Blockbuster Video and Disney Plus. Right? How many of y'all want to invest in Blockbuster Video? How many of y'all want to put investment towards MySpace versus put investment towards Facebook, towards Disney Plus? There was a guy who started General Motors. And this guy, his name was William Durant. And he saw kind of what the future was a little bit. He owned the largest horse and carriage buggy in the country. He made and sold more horse and buggy carriages than anybody in the country. But he gave that up to start and to build General Motors, which is now the largest car maker in the country. Because he saw a short-term investment versus a long-term investment. What Jesus is saying is, if you're investing here on earth, what you're doing is you're putting all your money towards Blockbuster Video. It will go away very soon. Don't put your money here. Put your money here. Don't store up treasures on earth. Store up treasures in heaven. The next thing Jesus tells us is from verse 21. He says, wherever your treasure is, take a look at it, wherever your treasure is, the last two lines there your heart will also be. So the second reason why we don't need to store up treasures on earth is because our heart will follow our wallet. Your heart will always follow your wallet. Your heart will always follow your wallet. Your heart will always follow your wallet. I love Jesus. Really? Let me see your wallet. Let me see your checking account. Because I'll know what you truly love based on what you spend your money on. Right? I'll truly know what you love and what you're prioritizing in your life based on your money. And what Jesus tells us here is he gives us two things. And let me jump to verse 24. This is really next week. Let's cheat a little bit. Let me jump to 24. He says, no one can serve two masters. In other words, your heart's going to be devoted to something. You can't serve two masters. You'll either hate one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and be enslaved to money. Money makes a great servant, but a horrible God. Money makes a great servant, but a horrible God. Your heart will follow your wallet. Now, as I look at verse 21 and 24, where your treasure is, the desires of your heart will be also. If you can't serve God with money, typically I read that as kind of like a negative connotation. Right? I think we're tempted to kind of read that as a negative connotation. But I want to flip that this morning. And I want to flip that and let that be a promise to us. Let that be a positive promise to us. Because here's the thing. You want to know that you're loving God? You want to know that your heart is chasing after God? Then let your wallet reflect your heart. So here's the promise. Where your treasure is, the desires of your heart will be also. Hey, I want to chase after God more. Begin to put your wallet in what you want your heart to go after. You can let your wallet lead your heart. You can let your wallet lead your heart. You want to love God more? Devote more of your wallet to God. Because where your treasure is, there your heart's desires will be also. Man, it's a promise. It's a promise. It should be a reassuring promise. It should be a liberating promise for us. Jesus says you can't serve two masters. You can't serve God and money. Man, that's liberating for me. Because I can serve God and not have to worry about the next deal, the next promotion. Not have to worry about losing my integrity over business ethics. As John Maxwell says, there's no such thing as business ethics. There's just ethics. And either you got them or you don't. And I can let my wallet lead my heart, and then I can know that, you know what? I can be a person of integrity. I can give a fair price. I can give a good day's work. Because I'm not serving the dollar. I'm not running after the dollar. I'm running after God. My wife was at a training in Texas this week. It was for soon-to-be financial advisors from all over the country. Came to Plano, Texas. And she said, some of those people have the right attitude. Some of those people, they're just after the dollar. They're just after the dollar. And Jesus says, where your heart is, there your treasures will be. You can let your wallet lead your heart. So the question is, if Jesus says in verse 19 through 21, if don't store up treasures on earth where moths and rust, thieves steal and break in. Store up treasures in heaven where they'll last for eternity. If that's the case, then how? How do we store up treasures in heaven? That's the question to ask. Jesus says, store up treasures in heaven. Well, how do we do it? This is where I say that Jesus is talking about your money. Jesus is talking about my money. Jesus is talking about an exchange. You see, we do an exchange. We do a money exchange every single day. Every single day we do a money exchange. I go to Fred Meyer. I'm looking for a new pair of shoes. I have a personal conviction. I'm not going to pay over $35 for a pair of shoes, right? Not a pair of tennis shoes. So I go to Fred Meyer. I see a pair of tennis shoes in there for $55. And I said, I'm not willing to make that exchange. My $55 is worth more than those shoes. But if I see a pair of shoes on sale, and by the way, I'll wait for them to get on sale, and then, Fred Meyer will do that like extra clearance sale. I'll wait for that, and then hope they got a 13 floating around. But if I see a pair of shoes for $30, okay, those shoes are worth that exchange. I'll exchange $30 for that pair of shoes. I don't eat organic apples. You know why? Because I ain't going to pay $5 for a daggone apple. Right? It's not worth the exchange for me. I'll just buy a regular apple and wash it a little more. Right? It ain't worth that exchange. And so when we talk about how do you store up treasures in heaven, Jesus says there's got to be an exchange. The money that we have on earth, we've got to view this as saying it's not worth what the treasure in heaven, the treasure on earth, the treasure on earth is not worth nearly as much as the treasure in heaven, so we got to be able to make that exchange. We got to be able to say, Jesus, I'm going to give my money for the furthering of your kingdom so I can build up treasures in heaven, because my earthly money is worth less than my heavenly money. My earthly treasures are worth less than my heavenly treasures. My grandfather was a great businessman, and he owned 10 convenience stores. He had, at one time, 3 different gas distributorships, one in South Georgia, one in Middle Georgia, one in North Georgia. And so he became a collector of things. And one of the things he collected coins. Now, as a grandson, we had no idea. Like, there were 10 grandkids. We had no clue. It wasn't until after he died, and my grandmother for Christmas, started giving us all these coins. We're like, where are these coins coming from? Well, your grandfather in the 80s started collecting them. Like, he just went through a phase. I don't know. Just went through a phase where he started collecting coins. One of the coins he collected, he got a complete set of Peace silver dollars. Now, these are really interesting. Peace silver dollars. Y'all ever heard of the Peace silver dollars? These are silver dollars that the U.S. government issued post-World War I. So from 1921 to 1935, these were the silver dollars. And they were peace because of the peace in the world after World War I. And so my grandfather got a complete set of Peace silver dollars. And so my grandmother gave these to me. I was about the only kid that showed any interest in his coin collection, so she just gave me a lot of his old coins. And this was one of the ones that she gave me. And so my grandfather loved history. And so for him, these aren't just silver dollars. These are truly a piece of history. This is truly post-World War I American history. And so for my grandfather, he looked at the money he was making, and he said that the coins that he was collecting, it was worth the exchange. One treasure for another treasure. And so I don't know what he paid for these. I don't know how much they're worth now. You know, coins, I don't know if y'all know much about coin collecting, but like you can have a coin that's like a 1921 coin. It's only worth $10 because it's not in great condition. So I have no clue what this is worth. It may be worth $100, it may be worth $10. I don't know what it's worth. But my grandfather saw this collection, and for him, he said, I'm willing to make the exchange from my paycheck to silver dollars. Because he wanted a piece of history, and he wanted an investment. And when we think about exchanging our earthly treasures for our heavenly treasures, in our minds, it comes down to what my grandfather thought. Is it worth the exchange? Is it worth the exchange? And if we can look at the heavenly treasures and say it's worth the exchange, then man, we'll gladly make the exchange. We'll gladly make the exchange. But Rusty, you don't understand. If I do this, then my monthly bills and this and that. That's next week. I hear your objections. I make those objections myself. That's next week. This week, I just wanted you to hear the words of Jesus. And I wanted you, in your mind, to begin to think through. Is it worth the exchange? Is it worth the exchange? Is the earthly treasures, is it worth exchanging those for heavenly treasures? Is it worth exchanging those for heavenly treasures? And when I say heavenly treasures, guys, I'm talking about giving in a way that builds God's kingdom, right? That's what I'm talking about. And first and foremost, that place is the local church. But now for Natalie and I, we don't just stop at the local church. We give to the local church, but we don't stop at the local church. We give to other areas, right? And so that's how Natalie and I have constructed our 15 years of marriage. Is we first give to the local church, but we don't stop at the local church. We give to other areas. We give to other ministries. And when Natalie was doing disaster relief with Katrina back in whenever Katrina hit New Orleans and Mississippi, there were a lot of different relief agencies there. And some of y'all aren't going to like what I'm going to say. But let me finish it, and then you'll hopefully hear me out. I told Natalie, I said, whenever a disaster hits, because they hit every year, I never want to give to the Red Cross. And she got mad about that. I said, I never want to give to the Red Cross. I want to give to organizations that do the exact same thing as the Red Cross, but then also have a gospel influence. See, I can give to Samaritan's Purse, I can give through North American Mission Board, I can give through the International Mission Board that do disaster relief, but do disaster relief, all the cleanup, all the housing, all the food prep, all the meal prep, and still share the gospel. And so when I talk about exchanging our earthly treasures for heavenly treasures, that great exchange, what I'm talking about is building God's kingdom. Building God's kingdom. And being able to take our money and say, I'm going to use this and build God's kingdom with it. So that at the end of our lives, we can know that God used us to build His kingdom, to pass that baton of the gospel on to that next generation. And for us, what we want to do as Trinity is, man, we want to make new disciples. We want to give out 300 Bibles at July 4th. We want to do Angel Tree, where we're able to partner with parents who are in prison and provide Christmas presents to kids. Beverly, in just a couple moments, is going to do an announcement about the transitional youth, where we want to begin to take up some money for homeless girls and boys, teens. We want to do that, but man, we want to share the gospel in what we're doing. And we also want to build up and train up. We want Trinity to be a place where you learn more about Jesus and you're trained up on how to share your faith. And like the training that Daniel did about the cybersecurity. We have blanket statement, twofold mission here. And you can word it however sexy you want to word it. But twofold mission. We want to make new disciples and we want to build up the current disciples. Now, however you want to word that, whatever that makes you feel good about life, you word it that way. But two things. Make new disciples out of these walls and build up the disciples into these walls. That's what we're after. And that's exchanging our treasures so that we can be Scrooge McDuck in eternity. Man, y'all remember this story about Jesus was hanging with his boys, the disciples, Rustyism, hanging with his boys. And he's seeing all these rich people, they're in the temple. And he's seeing all these rich people putting in money into the collection plate. But they're not just putting in money in the collection plate, they're doing it in a very loud there's the coins. They're making all kinds of racket. Is that a southern term, making kinds of racket? And Jesus is watching them just make all kinds of racket with their money. And then he sees a lady with just a coin that is worth next to nothing. A penny, right? And the disciples, interesting thing, the disciples don't even see her. Jesus sees her. And just imagine all the guys in their rich robes, the men and the women in their rich robes, and making all kinds of racket, putting in the money, and that's good. The temple needed it. It was necessary. The temple needed it. But that one lady that nobody else noticed, Jesus noticed. And Jesus calls the attention of his fellows. And he He says, guys, did y'all just see what happened? Did you see what happened? She gave more than all them. She gave more than all them. And man, that's exchanging the earthly treasures for heavenly treasures. Exchanging earthly treasures for heavenly treasures isn't something that the super rich do. It's not something that it's something that it's not even that we're commanded to do it, not that we're called to do it, but that we have the privilege of doing it. We have the privilege of doing it. And next week, we're going to talk about our opposition to it, our objections to it, and the angst that we feel in exchanging the earthly treasures for heavenly treasures. So that's going to be next week. As Matt and the team come up to lead us, I just want you guys to think about that exchange. Think about that exchange. Think about how you're doing with that exchange. How are you doing with exchanging earthly treasures for heavenly treasures? How are you doing and undergirding the work of building God's kingdom? How are you doing with that? Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the privilege that we have in getting to build up your kingdom. And Lord, I know that it gives us some angst. We have some objections, but Jesus, what about? Lord, I know we do. I do. I'm no different. And so, Lord, I pray, God, that as we this week think about that exchange of earthly treasures for heavenly treasures, Lord, I pray that you will just work on our hearts. And that we'll take that long-term view, that eternal view, and that we won't just simply build up our own kingdom here on earth. But God, that we can be a people that are building your kingdom. We can be a people that are building your kingdom. Lord, I pray that we get treasures. I pray that we're successful at work. I pray that we get the deals, that we have the successful businesses, that we get the promotions. But Lord, I pray that we get all that with the mindset that we get in order to give. And that it can be our joy, not our duty, but Lord, our delight to give and to build up your kingdom. In Jesus' name, I pray. Amen. I want to invite you guys to stand and sing with us this next song, Generous Giver. And just as we sing and as you sing these words, I want you to be thinking about that exchange that we, not that we're commanded to do as though we're feeling guilty, but that we're privileged